Nick and I have always talked about our addiction to teaching, about teaching, in terms of a kind of strange addiction. But I know that when I was teaching in the university, I would take on more than I should have done.
I'm just a postdoc on a 3-year position, and I agreed to lead a core master's module of over 100 students just because I have this strange addiction to, doing more teaching and more teaching. It was ridiculous. In no way should I be doing this, but...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it corresponds anyway, it's associated, isn't it, with the question that you raised concerning lack. That teaching is a kind of some kind of response to and a temporary salve, as it were, for a lack. And I think we both talked to one another about a certain kind of feeling of emptiness when you finish a teaching session, or you finish a teaching year. And I remember students, used to ask me at the end of a year when they were going to go on to finer and better things, will you miss us? And I used to say, no, I don't miss it. Because there's another crowd coming next year that will fill the same void, as it were.
That's true. I mean, really, the year ends as an academic and you should really be living the dream. You have, your job is mostly to read and write. And yet there is a sort of emptiness to it that's not there in the teaching term, despite the fact that you will complain. I've just came up in the lift and, a colleague in the lift is like, how you doing? I was like, 4 hours teaching today, So it's a regular source of complaint, but yet kind of something compulsive about doing it. And as soon as that semester ends, I'll be very sad I'm not teaching. I have to be there doing it all the time.
The end of the semester is when the real for me intrudes, in the sense that that's when I finally get sick, right? That's when the colds that I've been facing and fighting off the entire time, they just, right when I'm about to go to the seashore or otherwise just enjoy myself and do all those other things or do the writing that I have to do, I'm just out prone and depleted and something, even if teaching is this sort of wonderful activity, and I think the addiction is the right term, where it's not necessarily less than the sum of its parts, so you can walk out of a classroom feeling invigorated. Somehow that economy of intensities just hits, in the termination phase, a hard stop for me right when I feel like I should be most free and capable of savoring it.
And you forget, too, is the funny thing, is, how many years have we all collectively put in terms of, semesters or trimesters or whatever, quarters or whatever system people are on. And at the end of every semester, because Patrick's on a less traditional teaching schedule than I am, but I'm on the semester. And I'll always say, I'll be like, I don't know why I feel this way. And he'll be like, because you feel this way the last week of classes, every single semester, and every single time you say that. And I'm like, I don't know, this time it feels different. But I've just actually, I've just, well, I guess there's a word for that, and it's repression.
But I think teaching isn't it? It's where you most kind of, in a kind of stripped down fashion, you inhabit a certain kind of symbolic order. And your place in that order is assured. The order is assured temporarily, maybe at the level of fantasy, and then when it stops, you have to kind of confront all that other stuff that's above and beyond and underneath and behind. Whether it's the kind of all the admin that you haven't done because you've been absorbed in your wonderful teaching, or some other kind of manifestation of the real that's bound to kind of intrude.
Yeah, there's a sense of slipping through the cracks when the term ends, isn't there? That suddenly, you feel that place and purpose that you had sort of evaporates quite easily. We said in the book that there's always this, both the Sunday night jitters, but even more so when it's September and you're about to start the new year. And there's always this chatter on the first day, which is usually a training day. Oh, I've forgotten how to teach. I've forgotten how to do it, as if it's this thing that kind of slips away from you. And then everybody says the same thing in a couple of days, like, oh, I've clicked back into it now. And you can kind of readopt that symbolic position, and suddenly you feel whole again. Even if it's a source of complaint for you, it gives you the capacity to, give you a sense of self, a sense of meaning and purpose and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's funny.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome both of the authors of the wonderful new book, The Lacanian Teacher, Education, Pedagogy, and Enjoyment, Nick Stock and Nick Peim. Nick Stock is a British Academy postdoctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, UK. He was an English teacher for 13 years before starting his current research, which explores the unconscious desires of teachers and the drives at work in teaching. His work draws on psychoanalytic theory, post-structuralist philosophy, literature, radical politics, and theories of educational alternatives. He teaches modules on critical approaches to policy, citizenship education, and the politics of everyday life. Nick Peim lectured education, initial teacher training, and research philosophy at the University of Birmingham, UK. He has taught and written about cultural and curriculum politics, about education as governance, research theory, and philosophy. Recent publications include Rethinking the Politics of Education from 2022 and A Critique of Pure Education from 2024. He is currently writing a book on the philosophy of Catherine Malibu with Palgrave. Nick, welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness. We are so excited to talk with you today about knowledge and lack and enjoyment and Lacan and teaching and fantasies and so much more. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you very much for having us. Very nice to be here.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So let's get into it. I had the really good problem when preparing to talk with you both that I had dozens of questions and I had to pare them down because the book is just so rich, both theoretically and also in terms of how it made me reflect on my own experience in the classroom. And I'm interested for you to tell our listeners a little bit about the origins of this project. So can you each tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and how you made your way to this collaborative project on the Lacanian Teacher?
I'll go first. I suppose the first, confession is that the other Nick was my doctoral supervisor when I started my PhD, which was in philosophy of education a little while ago. To give a little anecdote of what it was like. My first meeting with him, he gave me 3 pieces of reading and said, these are the things that you should be exploring. And one was Structure, Sign and Play by Derrida. One was The Question Concerning Technology by Heidegger. And the other one was Zizek's How to Read Lacan. And I read all 3 and it's like, well, these are all kind of, life-changing works, as you say, real bangers. But I couldn't do them all. It was too much to take on. And so I picked Derrida and Heidegger, who have of course, a very intimate relationship. And I said, I'm going to put a pin in Lacan and come back to it later. And that's what I did, basically, when I got to the end of my PhD. It was what I came back to. And I'd been looking a little bit at it over that time. But so really, I wanted to do something about Lacan. But there's something interesting about the relationship between, doctoral supervisor and supervisee. And in terms of what we were both working on as well, that, I'll let Nick say more about that in terms of what our kind of areas and interests were in, his research and the research that I kind of took on underneath him. Underneath, that's a slip in itself, isn't it? You can say more about that, Nick.
Okay, well, I feel a bit like, Colin Quinn, who does Long Story Short. and he tells the history of the world. So this is the history of my world. So I started out as an English person. So the English was my subject. I was strongly interpolated as a young person. And I became an English teacher, mostly because I couldn't get funding to do doctoral research. And then I discovered that I enjoyed English teaching, and I was a kind of a believer, and attached myself to the idea of a grand educational project within a grand educational narrative, or an educational grand narrative. And during that time, a friend of mine who was also my head of department went to Oxford and came across all this stuff that was coming into English studies at the time from the literary theory then. And it turned, there were three big names I remember. One was Foucault, one was Derrida, and the other was Lacan. And I thought, well, I ought to kind of get to know these figures. Initially, I wanted to get to know them in order to reject their attack on my kind of cherished way of thinking and being in the world. But then I found a kind of reversal of that. And I became sort of entrenched in trying to work my way through these new ways of thinking. And so I gradually kind of moved away from that strongly interpolated English teacher into being something in between. So I remained kind of committed to the educational idea and became more kind of philosophically, theoretically oriented. And I drifted into university teaching and finally got a full-time post at University of Birmingham, where I worked for 20 years, where I was very lucky to have a great deal of freedom. Again, much of that kind of happened accidentally, but I was able to pursue my own interests and gradually also kind of drifted away from my commitment to the grand educational project, and came partly through Derrida, but I think more crucially through Heidegger, to want to kind of revisit all of that. In the meantime, I'd always kind of had this very strong desire for Lacan. And I'd started a PhD in the 80s when I was still a school teacher on Lacan, that I just wasn't able financially and time-wise to get stuck into. And so I kept going back to Lacan, and Lacan became one of my key points of reference, especially, I think, and I still think that I tend to think of Lacan in relation to education as being significant, or Lacan's significance has been signaled by the fact that Louis Althusser sat in his classes and was clearly immensely influenced. And now Althusser's kind of rethinking of the Marxist perspective through Lacan and partly through Freud, but more through Lacan, I think, was very influential. So I'd undergone this massive kind of, or series of transformations, and had, found myself at the same time with Nick as he pestered me, actually. And I was, I had lots of doctoral students. So I wasn't on the hunt for a new, doctoral student. And he kept reminding me that we should meet, and that he wanted to do this. So I succumbed to his will, as it were, and we met. And I think at first you were doing something on Rorty, weren't you?
Yeah, I was working with Richard Rorty for a while. Yeah, but the kind of strong liberalism of it came to be a little frustrating after a while. But he's kind of like a gateway drug to other philosophers, which is what happened with me.
Yeah, but he was also kind of watered down Derrida, watered down Heidegger, and he was a kind of Cracker Barrel philosopher, I always thought, who had this kind of just this kind of easygoing liberal aura that wasn't really good enough, I didn't think, to confront what I increasingly saw as this monstrous phenomenon the education archipelago, as I came to call it, borrowing Solzhenitsyn's language there. We hadn't really talked about Lacan while we were talking about Nick's thesis, but afterwards we remained quite closely in touch. I retired, and we'd meet up or talk frequently, and Nick kind of forced me to read Lacan properly. So he said, I'm going to read the seminars. So we read several of the seminars together, and so I had to go back and revisit Lacanian ideas that I already kind of written about in a kind of a loose sort of way in various books I'd written, especially in relation to questions concerning subjectivity and education. And then Nick came up with the idea of doing a book on teaching, and we'd talked a lot about teaching and our kind of ambiguous relation to it. Because while I think at that stage both of us had kind of given up on the notion of the great education project, we still, found ourselves being, I use the word in inverted commas, happy teachers. So, there was something interesting we felt going on there, and we wanted to attempt to kind of give an account of it. What was our interest in teaching? And also, I think, every now and then, there is a manifestation of a general interest in teaching. And in relation to, what Basil Bernstein, the British sociologist, had called a pedagogized society, well, I began to refer to a pedagogized world. So teaching wasn't just, one dimension of the world as we saw it, as I saw it. But teaching was somehow written into contemporary kind of ontology, the kind of condition of the world.
I just add to that there was a kind of inciting incident that encapsulates a lot of it. That in the Viva for my PhD, and again, my PhD was mostly a deconstruction of the educational project throughout, the history of Western philosophy, really. Mm-hmm. And it was known, and I made it known in my thesis that I was a teacher and continued to teach. And of course, the thesis was about education. It sat within a university. The process that I was in was a doctoral relationship and a doctoral examination. And so the question really was, how can you do it? How can you be both this, kind of this position on education, and yet able to be so deeply embroiled in it?
Yeah.
And, at the time, all I could really kind of say was, well, I enjoy it. But that was, it's a telling word, really, because it kind of made me and Nick and I start to reflect on, even holding such a position, what is it about teaching that does engender enjoyment and does sustain our ability to somehow continue within it, even if you don't necessarily buy into some of the kind of grander narratives about education?
Listening to you both, and forgive me if this is sentimental, I just wanted to register my appreciation to the two of you individually, but also as a pair, for simply being teachers in the first place, but also for making teaching so central to your engagement with these daunting theoretical figures. And I think oftentimes of that sort of horrible phrase, like those who do and those who can't teach, right? Which is a canard on many different levels, because many of the people who do, the research work or even are the theorists themselves, like, frankly, just can't teach for shit. And there's something about the singular way that your work in this book, and as you're describing it now, self-reflexively, self-consciously, and very committedly engages with the teaching as an impossible profession, but not simply in that theoretical register, but also in that you going against the grain of both institutional realities and that sort of, doing versus teaching, right? That sort of facile disregard, sort of tackle head on something we were almost talking about before we started recording, namely the absence of critical, or from my perspective, the dearth of sustained engagement with psychoanalytic thinking, with Lacan, in relation to the teaching enterprise.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of these themes of just desire, and that's something you both have already articulated, but also in terms of conditions of compulsion and constraint and interpolation that are very material and institutional. And I just wanted to, again, register my appreciation for your both doing this work, for the book you've written, and for existing and thinking in these ways.
I think there's a point that Nick makes in response to that, which is that, much of educational discourse actually assumes that the teacher is a kind of a cipher, that the teacher is a kind of taken for granted entity, and that the key figure is the student, and the key kind of event or practice is learning. And so we wanted to do something different from that, and I think shifting that perspective was part of the intention of the project. And of course, both of us found Lacanian thinking as the appropriate source of ideas for doing that.
So let's talk about this figure of the teacher, which certainly looms large in the book, but you also make quite a powerful case that the figure of the teacher looms large for all of us, not just folks like the four of us who are actively engaged in the work of higher education, or the work of education, full stop, but that it's a figure that activates very powerful fantasies, not only for teachers and students, but for everyone. And by way of letting our listeners in on the way that you set up this argument about the relationship of the teacher to fantasy, or to multiple forms of fantasy, I want to read a passage that starts the book. And this is also where you both had me. I was like, all right, I'm in. And it's going to take us into this terrain of both the fantasy of the teacher and the way that Lacan destabilizes that fantasy. Quote, "If you ask a teacher why they got into teaching, you might hear an eerily repetitious response. They are likely to enunciate a predictable set of desires, usually bound to salvific and redemptive subject positions. Making a difference, helping others, guiding children, giving them a better future. Lacan recognizes the sickness in these sorts of desires, the, quote, aggressivity that underlines the activity of the philanthropist, the idealist, the pedagogue, and even the reformer," close quote. From this point of view, redemptive desire is always already coupled with the horror of its death drive, its aggression, and its ceaseless pursuit of enjoyment. There is thus something unsettling and perverse about the desire of the teacher, and something we should be concerned about when we take the logics of education as they are always presented to us, as inherently good. The purely positive orientation of education is disturbed by any serious Lacanian account, close quote. So in your book, this passage is followed by a series of primal scenes of teaching that teachers often recount. And, this to me rang very, very familiar as well. Partly as somebody who used to run an institute for teaching and learning. I was like, yes, I've heard these stories. A moment of knowing, here, like the language of vocation comes to mind. Like, this is my calling. This is my vocation. This was a moment, when like young me knew that I was destined to become a teacher. And so with all of this in mind, can you talk to us about how thinking with and through Lacan has helped you explore both fantasies of this figure of the teacher, but also fantasies of teaching itself?
Mm. I mean, I suppose one thing just to say before launching into Lacan more specifically is how kind of uniform a lot of these, as you said, these primal scenes really are. This is something that I've felt myself as a teacher, something that you find talking to other teachers. Nick trained English teachers for quite a while, and still has a lot of the the things they'd prepare for him in terms of why they were applying for the course. And it was, you described it once as it's like there's a script that's being secretly passed around that everybody has to read from. And so there was already something quite perplexing about that for a job that, is undoubtedly quite complex and quite multifaceted in terms of what it offers and what you can do. But yet there's something quite uniform and singular about the reasons that people cite about why they get into it. And so already a figure like Lacan is quite helpful in engaging with something like that, because it raises the questions of what do we want, and where do those wants kind of come from? How are they formed? And especially if they're being formed in quite a kind of singular way, it gives us an impression that it's almost like they're being borrowed from somewhere. And so, we start to see already some of these really kind of key Lacanian concepts of ideas like fantasy and the symbolic order, that although, he doesn't think that we're without agency and without ability to act of our own accord, we're often, taking ideas from a kind of a broader structure of language and meaning that we are using to formulate our own desires and wants. And so there's something quite curious going on there. We do give a few specific examples, but I don't know if you wanted to jump in, Nick.
Well, I would add to that I think the Lacanian perspective is very, very powerful in that sense. And it does something I think that's quite radical, and that you just cannot get. This sounds maybe a little kind of adulatory. You can't get it anywhere else. And I think it hinges on the absolute predominance, the insistent, almost kind of manic repetition of the word signifier. And the position that the signifier occupies in Lacan's discourse, it's a kind of linguistic term, but it's also a symbolic shorthand for those kind of powerful discourses that frame the ways that we think and the ways in which we understand at a kind of more or less conscious level our being in the world. And I think kind of power, the real sort of powerfulness of that is that it deconstructs the idea that we are in some way, and much more so than Freud does, that we are subjects with a content that comes before we become what we become. And I think Lacan's undoing of that is one of the most kind of powerful things that can explain how, we become whatever it is that we become: teachers, parents, football fans, or, whatever it is that we are in the world. And I think it's, at a kind of almost fundamental ontological level, Lacan gives us that kind of way of thinking, that insight. I mean, and it breaks down into all sorts of other interesting and powerful dimensions.
There's also something peculiarly powerful and loaded, overdetermined, to use one of Pat's favorite phrases. The signifier teacher itself, right, carries with it, a lot in terms of kind of fantasies, images, strong discourses. I say that in the start of the book that it produces these responses in ways that other people often don't. There are some other professions that it might share these kind of strong phantasmatic images with, but for most people, you ask them why they do the job they did, and it's just kind of what they do, and they just sort of fell into it. It's just my job, and I go to work and I do this thing, or the pay was good, or I got offered a good position, or but teaching, and there are perhaps some other jobs that are a bit like this, but teaching in particular summons and generates so much.
Teaching has, of course, exactly the same contingency. Yeah. The same, I didn't become a teacher because I had a fantasy about change, Michael Jackson, like making the world a better place. I went into teaching because I needed a job. I had a child. I was married and so on, and I couldn't get funding to do a doctoral research. So, but then I kind of retrospectively, as it were, construct this, and it's not that I'm doing that, as it were, through my own resources, but that I'm drawing upon, what's already out there, as it were, the signifier of the teacher. And I always think of the phrase, language is what hollows being into desire. I think it's somebody's phrase for the Lacanian kind of perspective. I think it's Terry Eagleton's, actually. And it's a translation or transliteration. And that kind of overriding of the contingent with desire, again, is a very, I think, Lacanian sort of insight.
But it also demonstrates this retroactive dimension of becoming a teacher.
Yes.
But as you said, you've just like any job, actually, it's something likely you fell into. And so the research project that I'm on at the moment is mostly based around interviewing trainee teachers for as long as possible, in the kind of mode of a psychoanalytic clinic. So just encouraging them to talk and talk and talk and talk, really about anything, but with the rubric of understanding their desires to teach. So I don't ask them too many questions. They talk about what they want to. And of course, in the first interview, all of them, they recite the script about all the reasons they wanted to become a teacher. But some of them, over the course of hours of talking, the enunciation of that desire starts to become a lot more like what Nick is talking about, that it's a far more kind of either strange or complex path that has been retroactively turned into a primal scene. For one of them, for example, she kind of eventually kind of realized in herself actually what she wanted to be was a writer and a novelist and a poet. And she had kind of reimagined that desire in the figure of the teacher, because the teacher is loaded with these fantasies of being an intellectual and being a scholar and being a creative. And you might find it's quite dissatisfying in those endeavors eventually. But looking back, originally all she saw was, I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to help people. I wanted to make a difference. And, the real problem was that for me, it rang very true, because I kind of realized, well, actually, that was also what I wanted to do when I started teaching. I planned on being a writer and being an author. And so, again, there's a strong kind of idea that something is happening to us. Right. I am an author. So I realized my desire. But
how does it feel to traverse the fantasy?
Not good, of course.
It never does.
Because I will always have never written the novel. Nick and I always talk about Derrida's work, The Postcard, and how it kind of reveals. Nick hates it, but I really like it. But it revealed his desire that actually really what he wanted was not to write about James Joyce, was to be James Joyce. So that was what he wanted all along.
He's a great philosopher, but as a novelist, he's rubbish. Yeah.
Nick, I want to linger with some of the content of the sort of like eerily repetitive fantasy that gets expressed when you ask a teacher, why do you want to do this? And so much of it is of this sort of like, I want to do good, and I want to do good for those who are younger than me, right? I want to do, like, there's this vision of futurity, of flourishing. You don't have to like talk about eudaimonia and all of that stuff. You can just kind of be like, I want the world to be better in the future. Children are, a locus for thinking about the future. And I've always thought, this is idiosyncratic, I've always thought that pretty much unless you're a librarian or a fireman, it's pretty hard to be like, yep, what I get up and do every day is 100% morally defensible, right? And I think part of the fantasy of the teacher is that it is about this sort of doing good, and there's a seductiveness to that idea, while at the same time there is, and this is actually something that a therapist of mine said to me while I was in graduate school, trying to be like, what am I doing with my life? Is it okay that I'm like dicking around reading Lacan and Irigaray and Kristeva, and isn't that just really self-serving? And she was just like, there's a narcissistic pleasure of teaching, and that might help you be a better teacher. You don't have to self-flagellate for that enjoyment. But I'm interested in, what's so distinctive about the sense of like, as a teacher, I am like, to invoke some Christian language, I'm like canonically emptying myself to offer things up to others. I'm getting to live the life of the mind, but it's not for me. It's for someone else.
Can I just piggyback something
sure.
on this too? And I'm thinking about what Nick in the lower right-hand corner of my screen said about the...
You got to say which Nick.
Nick Peim. What you said, I almost want to be like, I agree with Nick about Derrida's postcard, but I'm not going to say which Nick. Just to get that indeterminacy in there.
That's clever.
Thank you. But I'm just thinking about, in light of what Abby said too, and to encourage our audience to sit with the teacher as a signifier in that full sort of discursive sense, i.e. as something that implicates not just teachers themselves, but everybody, how even in those social encounters where you're meeting people for the first time, and we have, that classic American tick of, well, what do you do? And someone says they're a teacher. You're supposed to say, oh, good for you, right? You're not supposed to be like, I fucking hate them. And if someone...
Thank you for your service, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for your service, right? And that is precisely, I think, goes to like the live wire of what's both so beautiful and potentially exploitable about this position that's simultaneously capable or predicated on self-effacement, but also is prime for erasure in a variety of senses. And that this seems to bear on these narratives of why people become teachers in the sense that certain types of answers that we could imagine are unimaginably scandalous, right? If someone were to be like, well, it was either this or becoming a prison guard, or like, I really like paying for supplies for work out of pocket, or I love stapling things, or I really want to be in a room with pubescent children. Like, those are all incredible red flags.
But also it applies to some of the essential things that teachers have to do, which is why the Lacanian kind of comment is a breath of fresh air, isn't it? Lacan talks about sickness, aggressivity. These are not supposed to be, features of being a teacher. These are kind of unspoken, unspeakable even things. So, nobody says, I want to be a teacher because I really enjoy bossing people around. And I used to say to students, when I was giving seminars or classes to 60 or 70 postgraduates, I'd say, I don't normally behave like this. When I'm out in the street, I don't go up to, people at the bus stop and start asking them what they think about something or other in a kind of demanding way, inviting them to interrogate their most kind of fundamental ideas and prejudices.
That's why they killed Socrates, for doing precisely that. Yeah.
But that dimension of teaching is, I think, something that we had both latched onto, not only at the level of the individual teacher, but at the level of the project of education itself. It's a kind of an ontological feature that kind of spreads out into the fabric of the institution. The kind of global, the now global institution.
I mean, we do quite a lot of work in the book of tracing through, films, TV, policy, and our own kind of like personal case histories almost, to try and actually really navigate what some of these kind of strong fantasies are, that often do disguise a certain set of wants or acts or needs. And so like Nick said, if you actually really fundamentally enjoy bossing people around, but it can be kind of draped in this fantasy of, well, this is for the good of these young children, then that makes that bossing around not only permitted, but also especially enjoyable, because that it is a necessity for them. I spend a bit of time with Whiplash, the film where J.K. Simmons is, berating these poor music students. And again, you are dragged along with this narrative of, well, it's for their good, really, because they're going to be better musicians by the end of it. Even when he's slapping them around the face and shouting homophobic abuse at them, and their knuckles are bleeding. And although not every classroom is like that, there is a grain of that in the act of the teacher. And it kind of, it shows this demand to be listened to, this demand to be needed from the teacher's position. But as I said, it has this kind of drapery of fantasies that permit that wouldn't be seen in the same way. Everyone's got a crappy boss who likes to boss them around, and that's a subject position that just permits that. And you can walk away from the end of the day going, well, I'm just the boss. That's what I do. But to be able to exert that kind of action, and yet have the feeling of this is for a grander project. This is going to change society. Actually, if you don't listen to me talking about what this character in this Shakespeare play is doing, then you are letting yourself down, perhaps letting the rest of your life ahead of you down as well. What a great pleasure or an enjoyment to be able to think that about what you are doing.
Reading your book made me return to one of my favorite texts, and then a play and a film version, but I really like the original text and then the play version, namely Muriel Sparks's Peim of Miss Jean Brodie. Are you familiar with this? I don't want to...
I don't know it, no, but you can tell me all about it.
I can't recommend this to you both and to the audience more highly. It's a magnificent tale of a teacher at an all-girls school. I think it's in the 30s, which becomes an important plot point. And I guess I'm spoiling something for people. But
it's been out a long time.
It's been out, yeah.
It's
I think Maggie Smith is in the film version,
Yeah.
but do the novel or the play if you can. But she's a teacher who looms larger than life, and so everyone knows when you're getting her, this is going to be huge, right? And she has this imperious manner and this what later turns out to be actually incorrect etymological reading of what education is. She's educating, she's leading them out from some into light or whatever. It's this spurious Latin, which then becomes a bit of a point. But she has this refrain, which when you start the text sounds inspiring and exciting and truly remarkable. And it's, little girls, I'm in the business of putting old heads on young shoulders, and all my pupils are the crème de la crème. She leans into the French. Give me a girl at an impressionable age, and she is mine for life. And initially, this seems very, very inspiring, right? And you have these. There are other teachers
very
too.
Oh, captain, my captain.
Yeah, there are other teachers in this school. Some of them wind up, doing the eros of pedagogy in the wrong way and the terrible, terrible things. But as the play goes on, and these young women in her care, who are Mrs. Brodie's set, realize that there are other sets, but also start pursuing their own sort of trajectories, it grows steadily more and more ominous in its sort of implications. And her relationship to the world outside the classroom and the sort of her dynamics of control within the classroom become more and more about this question of sort of the narcissistic satisfaction. And again, I'm spoiling something here, but the pun about the leader type figure and her own politics reaches a head where she learns that one of her students, supposedly inspired by her, has gone to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And Miss Jean Brodie assumes, well, of course, she's off fighting for Franco. And in fact, she is not, and dies in battle with the Republicans. But the reason why I'm thinking about this, and why, again, the readings of the different films, which I think many of our listeners will know well, was so activating for me, precisely through this Lacanian terminology and framework that you use, was the very strong cathexis that the figure of the teacher bears on you as you mature, as they open up these worlds of thinking, these beauties of language to you. You're at this sort of ground zero, not just of institutional social reproduction, but of like learning your own mind or learning what's possible. And it's so incredibly fraught and so potentiating that it can go in all sorts of directions. And simply stipulating that, well, the people who can't do something, they just teach, right? Or there's an illusion between taking the teacher for granted or taking learning by centering the student in the way that Nick Peim, you brought up in the beginning. Like, we center learning as this transaction, and it's about the learning experience, can take for granted or even exclude the teacher as a kind of, or like a good teacher, as a condition of possibility for something that is radically potentiating and can go in all sorts of directions.
I mean, the Spanish Civil War example is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think, again, it speaks to another one of these kind of strong fantasies of, we call it the fantasy of making a difference. And it's not our dismissal that a teacher doesn't do anything. We think the teachers make all kinds of differences, but it wasn't necessarily the difference that you set out to make.
Right.
And so, you have this belief that, this person's gone to fight in the Civil War. Obviously, it will be on the side that I believe in, and it's actually quite the opposite.
That discourse of shaping minds it remains a powerful one within the kind of imaginary of teacher education. I very recently, just this week, I was moved to respond to I never do this, but I had to a LinkedIn comment by it was a prominent teacher educator, somebody who occupies a senior position within the national apparatus, who was extolling the kind of the virtues of training minds or guiding minds or shaping minds, I think was the phrase. And I thought, what horrible hubris and arrogance this is, to assume that you have the right or that you're qualified in some way to shape minds for the betterment not only of those minds but of the world itself. And it also reminded me of a very kind of common experience where you have a powerful teacher. We were talking earlier about Derrida. Derrida, shaped many minds, but if those minds didn't go in the direction he thought they should do, he would disown them.
Yeah.
This is a frequent kind of story about Derrida.
Freud being even more.
I was going to say Freud too.
Freud himself is
Yeah.
the fallout with Jung and so on. But this kind of pedagogical aggressive will to power is unspeakable, as it were, within the domain of education.
While we're entertaining stories that education doesn't want to hear about itself, let's return to the idea with which we began, which is a term that haunts the book and a term that haunts Lacanian thinking, which is lack, and also its twin term, wholeness. But in particular about how lack bears on our understanding of ourselves and on others as subjects. And there's a passage that I want our listeners to hear. Quote, "Becoming a teacher is a signifier of having become educated to the point of being able to educate others, a process magnified in academia by the granting of honorifics for the most educated subjects. But as the subject strives, consciously or unconsciously, to prevent itself from confronting its inherent lack, it must avoid the sense of not being whole and of not being master in one's own house. Students are presumed by teachers to be, albeit differentially, on the path to wholeness, completion, in becoming educated, whether formally through the signifiers of grades or more abstractly through the master signifier of education itself. The model student, in turn, believes that they can obtain completion as a subject by achieving education," close quote. So all of this seems to conjure a sort of drama, possibly even a tragic drama, wherein various subjects relate to one another and to themselves through narratives of lack, through yearnings for wholeness, and expectations of arriving somewhere different, possibly, hopefully less lacking, more whole than where they started. But, it's as any student to introduce a term that we've been talking about slightly less than the term teacher, as any student of Lacan can tell you, it's the case that lack is never lacking, right? So I'm hoping we can spend some time unpacking and sitting with what this centrality of lack to your analysis of what you could call the pedagogical scene, right, means both for broader fantasies of education and more specifically for classroom praxis. Or, I mean, I don't even need to get as technical as saying praxis, for what happens in a classroom.
I mean, I suppose just one thing to pick out is that I think it's in sections like this where you start to see how we're trying to not just talk about school, but that big capital E master signifier of education.
Yes.
And it's as you kind of pointed out, that it always feels like what makes education that rather than something else, rather than leisure or play or whatever. And it is this promise that you are getting something, that, there is some form of improvement, development, addition, supplement, something like that. But the complication with that in the Lacanian sense is that actually that lack remains unfilled always, which almost presents a sort of impossibility to this logic of education. And so, you said that there's a tragic scene there almost in this vision of lack.
Yeah, I think the education in some ways is always has to be predicated on lack. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter at what level or where you stand in the educational order. You have to, as it were, express yourself as being in a condition of lack, and that's the same whether you're a primary school child learning times tables who hasn't yet learned the 11 times table, or you're a professor embarking on a new research project in order to, as it were, heal some kind of lack in the order of knowledge. So lack is always everywhere, but lack is also, I think, in a sense, to do with, and for me, tied up with the grand order of education, the symbolic order, which demands of you a certain submission to certain protocols in the form of signifiers that we all must. And we Nick and I have talked about the fact that in spite of our unusually kind of critical stance vis-a-vis education as a whole, we're still in it. We're still caught up in its never-ending trap. We're still subject to that logic of lack, and we're still working on projects. I retired 7 years ago, more than 7 years ago, but I'm still caught in the trap of having to write more books. After my next book, then I'm going to write my novel, and so my lack is never ending. And I think that again, I had the feeling about Lacan that Lacan, more than almost any other thinker I can think of, perhaps more than any other, is in some kind of attunement with a kind of an ethic of, I call it a kind of tragic way of thinking. And it's there, I think Nietzsche signals it, and what's often, dismissed as his, his first kind of youthful book, which isn't as interesting as his later work, but I think it's far and away his best book. It's a stunning kind of account of another way of kind of thinking the history of philosophy and the meaning of being through the tragic register. And I think education, without knowing it, and always without wanting to acknowledge it, partakes of that kind of I suppose I'd call it a tragic sensibility or a tragic register. And we can apply this in so many ways on so many contexts.
I mean, there's also the interesting sense, you talked about classroom praxis in terms of how this plays out in the classroom, that this kind of mode of lack and moving towards not having it, it's kind of the enjoyment of the I know something you don't know. And that's ultimately felt, by ourselves. Nick's talking about this, setting himself this never-ending path of reading, and I'm sure we all do this to ourselves. There's always another book to read. There's always something else, and so there is something, of course, quite alluring about trying to kind of like receive this thing, and then in the classroom that's flipped in an interesting way, where you get the enjoyment of being the person who can pose that position as I have the thing that's going to fill your lack. And we all know, I'm sure, that when you finish that book that you've been building up to reading, you'll just pick up the next one.
You're still the same person.
You're the same person, and you have you probably skipped through the last couple of chapters because you wanted to get onto the next book that you were excited about reading. You had this never-ending kind of chain of desires because it's completely unfillable, and so you are not actually fundamentally changed or shifted by these things.
Very frequently there is a kind of it's difficult to acknowledge that ambiguity, the ambiguity that there is in self-assertion and submission, or between self-assertion. I'm a smart ass, if you like, because I have read Derrida. And if you haven't read the Derrida that I've read, then you're not quite so much of a Derridian smart ass as I am. And so I will assert my kind of Derridian smart assness over and above yours. And again, that's there is something kind of tragic about that, because somewhere or other there is someone, well, I know them actually, who's read more Derrida than I have, and who's more inward with Derrida than I will ever be, and so I have to confront my own need to submit to their, and of course this is all kind of played out constantly at the level of fantasy. Our kind of everyday fantasies that are on the one hand self-aggrandizing, but always at the same time undermining. It reminds me a bit of Coriolanus, the great warrior, who thinks that he's Rome's salvation and ends up kind of attacking Rome and being kind of cut to pieces by the Volscians in the process.
I want to invoke the figure of the student here in thinking about wholeness and lack. And, I'm 44. I've spent my entire life, except for 1 year, being a student, being a teacher. At this point, being a teacher longer than being a student. And some, I don't know, there's a lot of overlap, right? And maybe this is overly personal, but all of these things are, even as their structures, even as their positions, right? We started our podcast by talking about Lacan's subject supposed to know as a position in our very first episode on what is psychoanalysis, right? And we talked about these sorts of like the fantasies and the differentials of knowing and not knowing, and the comfort that there is as a student of being like, there is someone who knows, and I can identify with that person, and eventually, they will be my horizon for becoming, right? And so I guess I want to say, this is the part that I was like, is this too personal? I was like, I've given up a lot of things in my life. I've given up cigarettes. I've given up drugs. I've given up alcohol.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Some of them I regret.
All the alcohol.
I haven't given up books, and I haven't given up this fantasy that if I just, not that I think that I'm going to, traverse the fantasy and become this being of pure light and knowledge and enlightenment or anything like that. And as a teacher, I actually feel quite a lot of comfort understanding that the position that I hold in the classroom to represent the one with the knowledge, the person who can answer your questions, that's a position that I can take off and put on, and that it isn't an actual referendum on everything I do or know or whatever. But I do think that I want to hold on idealistically in some way to something being quite beautiful when you are a student, before you get to be in that position of teacher where you understand just how unstable and tricksy the subject's supposed to know is, that having that sort of horizon for becoming is actually like profoundly motivating. And it's, you know, the sort of, this opens up horizons that I didn't even imagine or I couldn't even know existed. You know, maybe that's a fantasy still, but it's a hell of a drug. And I think that's one that we're all still kind of hooked on.
Yes.
I think that's right. That, I mean, I very much, you know, think that it is a fantasy, but obviously it's one that we've all very much bought into. And you know, knowing that it's a fantasy doesn't stop its enjoyment. And this is, you know, another point
Yes.
of Lacan's work, right? That I can see that, but it doesn't stop it. That, you know, and Nick and I try to make it clear all the way through the book that we don't think that he and I occupy some position outside of these fantasies or outside of the educational symbolic, that if anything, we are more indebted to it than anybody else. That, you know, without it, we're nothing. And you know, this is why we even try and go through our own kind of fantasies of what is it that was appealing to us as, you know, students and teachers. And so I think it doesn't necessarily matter that it's a fantasy, because it can still be something you can derive enjoyment from. But I think it does matter what you couch that fantasy in, and, you know, what you think it's doing. And this is where, you know, we come back to this broader educational symbolic of, you know, the project of education as in some way a process of kind of betterment and improvement. That's the thing that very quickly can become quite troubling and quite, you know, dangerous, and is also what allows for these things we were talking about at the start, the aggressivity that undergirds it as well. And that aggressivity, of course, can be done to yourself as well. You know, you gave up cigarettes and drinking, but, you know, you probably punish yourself for not having finished the book that you wanted to read one night, or, you know, you
punish yourself by staying up late to finish it.
Exactly, right. So, you know, the one way or another, you are finding a way, you know, or just the omnipresent guilt of, you know, why am I just walking the dog right now? Why am I not sitting reading a book? You know what, I better put a podcast on so that I'm listening to some knowledge coming in. And, you know, I'm very guilty of these things because of course it feeds a very certain fantasy for me. But, you know, that aggression will find its way in some way, which is, of course, another kind of fundamentally Freudian point, isn't it?
I think the fantasy sustains another dimension as well. So, you know, we wrote the book, you know, in a certain kind of mood of disenchantment with education, but not at all disenchanted with our own capacities and kind of readiness, being equipped to reveal the necessity of that disenchantment to the world, so that we still are positioning ourselves as the, you know, the subject who knows, and we know things differently, and therefore we are in a sense more the subject who knows than most of you other suckers, if you pardon the expression, who are still kind of buying into you know, the general kind of cliched fantasies that are not so powerful as our fantasies. And tied up with that also, and I'm interested in this particularly, is the ways that we latch onto those kind of, I'll just use this phrase loosely, paternal metaphors, like Lacan or Derrida or Heidegger, or some figure that will, as it were, assuage some dimension of our lack in some particular direction, so that we can renew ourselves and occupy a kind of a strong position. And strong here, you know, clearly, you know, borders or reaches towards the aggressive position where we can assert our right to make claims about the nature of things and the nature of the world, the nature of the academic enterprise, and the nature of the whole kind of global condition, saturated as it is with education and so on. So we're always already kind of caught up in that logic. And we still retain some faith, and I get this from the kind of conversations that we frequently have, that we are telling the truth of things, not just telling the truth in a bigger way.
So we've been talking about lack, and I think we could get kind of caught in this like morass of pessimism entirely. But one of the reasons that I at least don't get totally depressed reading Lacan, or reading the two of you on Lacan and musing on, how the subject is always already split and fragmented, and how this relation to knowledge within the task of education is, you can't just like heap it up like smog sitting on a hoard and keep it forever. But, I don't get so totally depressed by it. It's because desire and lack are always twinned in Lacan's thinking. And sure, we can talk about the objet petit a and the structure of desire and how you can't get what you want because then you don't want it anymore the moment you get it. But one thing I think is really important about your book is that, even if we're working in this Lacanian framework where desire is always destined to be thwarted, pleasure, enjoyment, jouissance, if you will, is not foreclosed in this framework. Quite the contrary. Pleasure and enjoyment come to the forefront again and again. And that movement, call it a dialectic or a pendulum or a generative paradox, call it what you will, it makes its way even into the subtitle of the book, Education, Pedagogy, and Enjoyment. So I'm hoping you can talk to us about your thinking about the role of enjoyment in education, including how the questions of enjoyment can manifest both in knowing and also in the pleasures of not knowing.
I mean, I suppose, one of the things that we really kind of identify about teaching, and we were talking about this right back at the beginning, weren't we, that it has, as a position, it offers these kind of well springs of enjoyment in many, many different forms that maybe other kind of positions in work or in society don't necessarily offer. And you can, one of the key things that we identify is that you can see this so clearly in a figure like Lacan himself, who very easily, could have stayed as a practicing analyst that he was, seeing patients, writing papers, case studies, could have even written the inscrutable écrit and put that out there in the world. And instead chose to dedicate his life to teaching these seminars, these kind of wacky seminars, really. And in each seminar, he almost always anyway, refers to his position as teacher, the student's position as student, the complications of those. And so he's, though undercutting and self-effacing himself as a teacher and his ignorance and their ignorance as well, he is fundamentally finding something about that position that is a great source of enjoyment. The phrase that we used at the start, addiction for him. But he's doing it with an understanding of the teacher and their position of lack, the impossibility of being able to transmit knowledge exactly as you'd like it, which is often considered one of the reasons that he puts things in such an incoherent and riddled manner. Because if everything's coming across like a riddle anyway, then why not play further with that? And so I suppose one of the reasons that we use this idea of a Lacanian teacher is it's not just teaching through the ideas of Lacanian theory, but also that Lacan was a teacher. And you can clearly see that it is such an enjoyable position. Even when you are identifying a lack of knowing, there is something about that position on a stage. That's the word that we use over and over again, that we talk about it like a piece of theatre. Classrooms, really, the space that they are most like is actually a theatre. And there's been lots of reorganisation of classrooms over the past, few decades. But normally, you move the seating around and you can move the desk around, but it's just another reorientation of an actor on a stage and an audience that are sometimes interacting with it and sometimes there to watch it. So there is this kind of enjoyment of the performance that, is kind of stood up and done, for many teachers, hour after hour, day after day. Even if it's a failed performance, there is a kind of pleasure in doing it.
Can I just comment there on your use of the word? You said it was depressing, or
I did.
I don't agree that it's depressing to live without, and this applies to desire as well, to live without teleology. Mm-hmm. So if you give up on the teleological project, it doesn't mean there's nothing left. It means that you reorient yourself towards what is. And I think that's the big kind of positive, I would say, thing, which is, of course, not entirely positive. Just as jouissance is not the same as enjoyment. It's not pure, unalloyed enjoyment. But there is something active and engaging in it. And I think, if you give up on the idea that it's tragic that desire is never fulfilled, well, it isn't. If you look at it another way, desire is what activates and orientates and motivates. And, if we simply acknowledge that there's no teleology to desire either, then we can live differently with that, and we can enjoy the repetitions of enjoyment that are available to us. With perhaps different senses of purpose and meaning. That, for me, again, relates to the idea of giving up on the big project, the big, project of enlightenment, or the big project of progress, or the big project of education. That the opportunities are more than equal to what you give up on.
I was just going to say what this does to teaching is teaching as an act still remains the actual, the act of standing in a classroom or a teaching scene of some kind, speaking to an interlocutor, which is someone we position as a student. Those things can still continue and continue to be enjoyable, even when the common discourses and fantasies that we've spoken of are put to one side. And there might be something tragic about that, because in the way that we refer to it in the book is that you've really accepted your own death as a teacher, because you are no longer there to do anything, right? But this is exactly what Lacan says about jouissance, is that it is without purpose. It doesn't have a direction or an aim. And so this doesn't foreclose the possibility of the act of teaching, but it just kind of, as Nick says, it completely reorients.
It forecloses learning outcomes, maybe.
Yeah. Right.
And that entire apparatus.
You could say the same about being. Being doesn't have any kind of, there's no particular kind of purpose to it, and yet we wouldn't kind of give up on that. And I think it's important to distinguish between a certain understanding of pessimism and nihilism. And Nietzsche was right that pessimism is a sign of kind of decadence, is the word that Nietzsche used. But he was wrong, that nihilism was to be avoided. In a sense, nihilism is again, I would put it in terms of a clearing of the decks for the realization of different opportunities, and an acknowledgement that we can't escape from the domain of fantasy, but that we can be aware of the fantasies that we're living by and with and through, and we will not be in a position of mastery over those.
This seems like such a fundamental engine narrative paradox rather than a kind of terminal, abysmal aporia or end of the road. And the analogy that I want to bring in here too, just given our broader remit, is the process of psychoanalysis, right? The fantasies of the teacher and the psychoanalyst, or the fantasies we have about teaching, education, and psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, there's some similarities here, in the sense that there are things people do even as they are set in motion by certain desires or goals. And sure, things may happen along the way in the process. There may be symptom alleviation. There may be growth in metabolizing certain types of struggles for the patient, or certain types of patients and their struggles for the analyst. But there is this fundamentally open-ended process that acknowledges that, I mean, ideally at least, part of the entire itinerary is the journey itself. It doesn't necessarily arrive you at a position of absolute knowledge, absolute competency, absolute mental health, whatever the hell that would mean, precisely because the conditions of human existence will disabuse us of those fantasies, whether we choose to cling to them or not. And thus the issue is, the real task is, how do we accommodate ourselves better and make some room for maneuver or change, or relate to our fantasies and to one another with some better way. Yeah.
Very Lacanian way of thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what you said, it identifies something important about, the Lacanian approach to psychoanalysis, rather than, what has happened to much of psychoanalysis is it has been folded into psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And, I know Ian Parker writes about this a great deal, that psychoanalysis is not therapy. It is its own domain and its own discipline and its own way of being and interacting with others. And Lacan in particular, I think, attunes to that. He doesn't align himself with, ideas like health and cure. It is just its own process, a process of, the enunciation of desire and the complexities that goes along with that. In a relationality with another, the other is the analyst. So really, I think this way that Lacan orientates himself within the domain of psychoanalysis is very similar to what we are aiming for within the educational symbolic as well. This is one of the key ways really that Lacan does move away from Freud, that Freud still fundamentally sees himself as, the good doctor, as helping and curing ultimately. And, that maybe becomes muddied over the course of his career. But I think with Lacan, it's a far more kind of complicated relationship with what the goals and aims of psychoanalysis are, rather than just, getting better, even if your better is just ordinary unhappiness, that actually, trying to remove a sense of aim and betterment. So we do find something kind of useful about that in terms of what Lacan is doing in psychoanalysis.
I mean, I want to say in response, to what you're just saying right now, Nick, but also to Nick Peim, that I've personally, as somebody who is, deeply identified as a teacher, I find, and I think I always have found something deeply compelling about the classroom as a fundamentally ateleological space. I have bristled as over the course of my career, syllabi have had to expand to the point where you always have to tell people what they're going to get out of a thing before the thing has happened, right? There's a kind of predestination where I'm like, well, but I don't know. Like that's, if I knew what was going to happen and what you were going to learn, why would we even hold the class, right? The class is the thing. And of course there's this whole apparatus. I really hope like my provost isn't listening to this, but of, there's committees for assessment, and then there's certain learning goals. And if your class fulfills like X distribution requirement, then there's certain learning goals that it has to meet that aren't specific to what you are doing, but that map onto the structure of general education requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't get to put on an end of year report what happened in class, enjoyment.
Right. We talked about some stuff and it was cool.
We also we hung out together.
Yeah.
Right.
And the hanging out, often was, the most, certainly the most vivid.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to ask you is to justify what you're saying in those sorts of institutional terms. I don't want to. But what I do want to ask is if you can say a little bit more about how you understand enjoyment in the classroom, whether it is your enjoyment as a teacher, whether it is enjoyment of the student. I just want to see if we can kind of like play with this a little bit more.
Well, I think one thing I'd say, and again, trying to situate where does this sit within a kind of institutional discourse, is that Nick and I present pedagogical relationship as a fundamentally fraudulent one. One that is predicated on the possibility of the transmission of knowledge in a kind of a pure form for a kind of broader social goal. And though we reveal that as fraudulent, it also has a symbolic arrangement of relation between individuals that does produce a sense of enjoyment that I don't think necessarily other positions or other relations do always engender. And even an awareness of the fraudulence of that position doesn't inhibit the enjoyment, especially for the educator. This is one of our key things that, we said it near the start, that education is usually oriented around the kind of the student and what they need. But what we find is that actually often the person who's enjoying themselves the most in the room is the teacher. Yeah. And we also think that's fine, that's okay. To take an enjoyment in it.
It's fine. There's another side to it, though.
Yeah.
I think if we focus on enjoyment, we have to acknowledge, again, Lacan's very kind of clear on this in a different kind of way. But there was a very famous study done in Birmingham 40 years ago, more actually, 50 years ago probably. By a guy called Paul Willis. He wrote a book called How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. And he was looking at the behaviors of boys particularly who'd opted out of education because they knew that it wasn't going to kind of offer them benefits that they could cash in on. But they still went to school, and they went because it was an arena for them to practice certain kinds of enjoyment. And they weren't the official modes of enjoyment on offer, but nevertheless, they were very powerful. And they referred to the purpose of going to school as having a laugh. Mm-hmm. This kind of cutting across the official agenda was, very much a kind of part of what was going on. So the school was an arena for all sorts of enjoyment that weren't on the curriculum, as it were. And there are many kind of ways in which you can identify those kinds of enjoyments, those, off-piste, as it were, enjoyments happening within the education arena. But I remember when I was training teachers or working as the head of an English department in a secondary school, I would advise, teachers who were struggling with classes to just step back and enjoy the students' enjoyment and, admire the quality of the mucking around, because it's often very inventive what's going on. And if you kind of take a different approach to it, then it's possible to share in that enjoyment. And again, that's an enjoyment of kind of being with, rather than an enjoyment of, doing something too. And I think, that is a mode of being for both the teacher and the student within the educational apparatus.
I think it's especially, we're in the line of a kind of Lacanian ethic, that there are a set of, laws, capital L laws, that surround the symbolic order of education. And those laws are predicated on that, you must be engaging with the content and improving in some sense by being there. And therefore the transgression of those laws becomes a form of enjoyment. And it's exactly what Nick's talking about, the ways that students might find ways around of learning. It's quite magical to witness what they, the lengths that somebody will go to not to learn.
And the cool teachers find ways of doing the same.
Exactly.
The cool teachers, I can remember, asking years ago when I was a smoker, I used to ask, 17-year-old kids I taught, go down the road, get me a packet of cigarettes, and you can have one yourself on the way back. And so this is not, this is a kind of pleasure available to the teacher, but it's not obviously.
But it's only there because of the expectations of the interaction already. That the sort of enjoyment that you tend to find is an adherence to the educational law. So the student who doesn't listen is made to listen, and usually in the belief that the teacher tells himself, you will enjoy this if you do just listen to me, which is of course actually a return to that fantasy of me having something that you need to know. But actually, there is a law there that can be played with and transgressed, that's created by that relationship of me knowing something that you not, but that actually allows for these certain ways of being with each other that I really don't think are available in any other domain. And that is what is, truly enjoyable about being a teacher.
I want to ask you about Lacan himself as a teacher. He stands in for a lot of people as a sort of ultimate subject supposed to know. If people know one thing about Lacan, it's like he's hard, he's obscure, he's impossible to read, right? He speaks in this oracular or Vedic kind of way, bracketing to a certain extent this kind of larger than life legacy. I'm really interested to hear you both talk about Lacan himself as a teacher, first of all, but also what you have taken from Lacan as teacher and Lacanian thought more broadly writ about the ways that you approach the classroom, about the ways you approach students, that active teaching, the pleasures you allow or don't allow yourselves to take in it, the ways you understand those pleasures, the fantasies that you entertain or indulge, or the fantasies that you let go. And I want to flag something that was especially illuminating to me as a reader of this book is that, however idiosyncratic Lacan was personally, and however much deep engagement with his work can make a teacher or a student see education as a structure with new eyes, your argument here isn't using that to offer some sort of utopian way out of the double binds of the educational setting, structure, context, etc. You don't shrink from being really frank about naming and navigating the actual educational landscape. So can we talk about that landscape and about how Lacan helps you do that navigation?
I mean, the first thing that kind of comes to mind when you say all of that in terms of what we were kind of aiming towards with, not offering a utopian kind of exit out of this double bind. I kind of think of that classic, Beckett phrase of "I can't go on, I must go on."
Yeah.
But how can that be turned into something more enjoyable? Which I think is something that we provide, and especially in the final chapter of the book, that you'd think after reading the first few chapters that it would be impossible to be a teacher anymore in any kind of good faith way to yourself. But I suppose I think we do sort of offer something in that. And as I said earlier, I think this is clear in Lacan's own teaching in terms of the way that he teaches. Jameson, Webster, and others have referred to Lacan's teaching as a hysterical act on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And, fundamentally, the important thing is that he doesn't play an analyst's role when he's teaching. He doesn't, allow the students to kind of talk and he listens. And, he doesn't just make the kind of odd intervention. Instead, it's this fairly kind of free-form, free associative talk, perhaps under a rubric of some kind, with these sort of strange diversions that take place all the time. And you wonder what would his seminars have been like if he'd have treated his seminars as like a didactic exercise where he wanted, he says he wants to train analysts, and I think that's true in the fact that he puts them in this analyst position of trying to follow his hysterical monologues. But if we took that in a more kind of classical sense of I want to train analysts, of I want to give you the facts, I don't think we would be drawn to Lacan in the way that we are. That there is ultimately a seductive nature, something quite alluring to that hysterical mode. And I think the point being that you can read, seminar after seminar of Lacan and not learn a thing. you know, a single thing. But there was an enjoyment in the reading it, but especially there was an enjoyment for Lacan in the saying it in the first place. And that's where perhaps one of the places that we situate ourselves here.
I think it's very difficult to escape from the feeling that when you're reading Lacan, even though you're not understanding it, you're reading Lacan. Mm-hmm. And so it confers a kind of distinction upon you. And I think in some ways, you know, being a teacher within a classroom is almost always predicated on that kind of logic whereby you're teaching something, you're not guaranteed that it's going to be received as you imagine you're teaching it, and yet you're occupying that kind of special role, you're embodying that kind of distinctiveness in some way. And I think, you know, we have to, as Lacanians, acknowledge the fact that we're not really sure about why we're drawn to this immense figure, and that we kind of persist in attributing to Lacan a special kind of access to something, insight or understanding, articulation, however we might describe it. We can't collapse that into something, you know, manageable and clearly demonstrable, because it's never clearly there. And when we read certainly my experience of reading Lacan for, I hate to say this, but I've been reading Lacan, kind of reading Lacan for 40 years. That's terrible, isn't it? It must be, 40 years. So, but I also read Lacanians. And so, you know, I trust other Lacanians to give me access to Lacan. So I'm always kind of shifting in relation to, but always kind of oriented towards this figure. And you know, we can't kind of explain that away, really. I mean, there is something, I wouldn't say mystical, but there's some act of faith at work there.
There's a line that I was thinking about while you were talking from one of my all-time favorite essays by Jordy Rosenberg, which is about reading Judith Butler. It's Gender Trouble on Mother's Day. And there's just a passage that I wanted to quickly read that I think resonates so much with what you were saying, Nick. Jordy Rosenberg said, originally, I wanted to write this essay for students to tell them it is okay not to understand gender trouble, that reading and not understanding and keeping on reading is one of the singular pleasures and engagements of the life of the mind, and I guess the body too. And then he says, actually, about this kind of thing, Lacan once said something of importance. Do not give up on your desire. And the end of the essay, which is offered to students, says, you have something before you that we can never have again. You have the first time reading Gender Trouble, the living of a fidelity you cannot understand in the first reading. You are not meant to understand it now. You will understand Gender Trouble later. I promise you this, but you will never again not be giving up on your desire the way you didn't give up the first time you read it. Isn't that wonderful?
The even better thing is that not only do you get all of that, you also get to be the kind of person who reads Judith Butler. Yeah. And, you know, and I think one of the real things we take from Lacan is the idea of the gaze, and how always that is there in our teaching and in our reading as well. You know, and I get this from reading Lacan. I get to be the kind of person who reads Lacan, and I get the enjoyment of reading it coupled with the gaze of being the person who reads it.
It's also an activation of the ego ideal and the ideal ego that you know, we are in some way we're related to. We're in a relation with Lacan, and you know, we know that Lacan's not really a person. Lacan's an idea. Lacan's a signifier, and yet, you know, we still we never cease from speaking, writing, addressing Lacan as a person, as that kind of figure, authoritative, knowing, and with a pretty complete grasp of things.
He knows a few things, doesn't he? You know?
He knows.
I'm sitting here processing everything that we're saying and returning to something that Abby may have said off mic, but that we've also observed when it comes to doing anything involving Lacan. And here's the gaze for you, particularly on Instagram, right? When we post a picture of Lacan or we post a picture of your excellent book and we're like, we're going to be talking about Lacanian education or anything, people really, they hit the little heart buttons, like they want it. The seductiveness is there, and it's there too on the level of the ego ideal, but also Nick Sock, I'm thinking about this in the sense of like not just being a person who gets to read Lacan. And by the way, everyone listening, you get to read Lacan, right? Please do it. But also you get to be the person who someone else sees reading Lacan. And I think about those Instagram posts like, look at this fucker in the pub reading Lacan. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, maybe he's an asshole, but also you kind of want to know what his deal is.
in the White Lotus.
Yeah, you kind of want to know, right? It's a synecdoche for the seductiveness of knowledge as such, and people want it. And even as we ourselves do a lot of work resisting the impulse, or at least I'll speak just for myself, do a lot of work resisting the impulse to lapse into jargon that can be off-putting to people. I also, I got to hand it to the guy, and I don't resent doing this. You have to respect how standing in for complexity and standing in for that kind of open-ended, paradoxical intellectual engagement, or even just that massive output of prose, brings people in. It activates some kind of yearning for them. And I don't begrudge anyone that. But also, when one does read Lacan, right? And I always tell people, start with the first two seminars, right? Just go there. It's the most accessible in some ways. But dive in wherever you want. It simultaneously is this mixture of incredibly obscure, incredibly hard to follow, incredibly contradictory stuff, to the point that, and Nick Peim, I was thinking this when you said about Lacan's sort of clarity, or the question of clarity, how so often when someone says, well, Lacan clearly believes this, or as Lacan clearly says, I'm like, this person is a charlatan, right? What exactly do they mean, right? Lacan doesn't clearly say anything, or if he does, which Lacan are we talking about? Which period, which text, which transcription of which lecture, right? At a certain point, you almost get overwhelmed and you're like, enough. I've had enough. I have to put this down, right? Even as there are incredibly funny, brilliant lines or things that then come back in this kind of deferred action to hit you. So one is never really done with Lacan, even if you're done reading this book for now, or you've thrown it across the room, or you don't understand it. Instead, it becomes this process of building tolerance, perhaps, or of a willingness to engage with this experience of being confused, but also amused, being frustrated, but also strangely gratified, and doing that within the field of other people's expectations, but also your own. And making some peace with the fact that you will never arrive at a position of absolute mastery. And in fact, that fantasy itself has to be emptied. And in that sense, with these themes of like saying enough Lacan, or like this is endless, or like it'll never stop. And
interminable.
Also, it's interminable, yeah. This makes me think.
That's a great word, yeah.
The impossibility of Lacan too is the impossible profession of reading Lacan or of interpreting Lacan. I just wanted to share with you both this experience that I'm still processing now, which is just 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of teaching at this very small experimental school called the Matthew Strother Center for the Examined Life. It's only been in existence for a couple of years, and it's named after a remarkable young man who was actually a student of mine, who did some courses in psychoanalysis with me and then passed away very young. His widow and a bunch of his friends have put together this very small sort of fledgling experimental thing where we had 4, but up to 5 or 6 people volunteer to come to this little farm in the Catskills to read a text that they don't know what it's going to be, and to just do that, and then also do various types of engagement with the natural world, etc. And the text I picked, channeling Shoshana Fellman, my own perverse sort of sensibilities, and the Lacanianism of how I guess I see the world. I guess we are all Lacanians here one way or another, whether or not we want to be.
I'm not a Lacanian.
Okay, but go. She'll register resistance to Lacan. That's fine. I'll say I'm as good a Lacanian as I am a Catholic, which is not really either of those things. But I picked Freud's analysis, terminable and interminable. And it's 36 pages, and we just read it, and none of them had read much, if any, Freud before. But the reason I'm mentioning this is both because, again, it's just a fascinating experience. I'd like to have people check it out and maybe think about replicating this in some ways. But it was the creation of a situation with very clear constraints, 36 pages, 1 week, a very clear structure, but also one in which really just worked around the process of different people leading it in different days, teaching this small group, but also having to basically reckon, and I include myself with this being a text that is unassimilable in some ways, that there are things at some point, like, I don't understand what's happening here, and yet we're going to do it again. Or something is going to be clear one day and not clear the next day. And it was a fantastic experience, but that made me reflect on what I get out of teaching and what I'm also in some ways getting out of talking with you all and listening to all three of you, right? Which is this intense amount of not just like stimulus of other people's faces, of people reacting to things, but just simply being minds together, embodied minds in this process. And it made me think about if part of the experience of Lacan, of reading Lacan, is enough, right? I can't do this anymore, but then you come back. And if part of, well, and now Nick's talk, I'm thinking about what you said about teaching for longer than you want to, or giving of yourself more. And I've been in this position too, where it's like I teach a class for 3 hours and then I just want to stick around and hear what students are saying. And so I find myself not like holding court, but just sitting there quietly as students talk to one another for 3 hours. And as a clinician who I value deeply said to me in this, and this is the final thing that I'm saying, it was the best advice I ever received as a teacher. But I think now I'm hearing in light of your book as a kind of mechanism of action, but like a desiring trajectory for the act of teaching itself or for the experience of education at its best. And it's what this clinician said to me after pointing out how, of course, you do. After everything I know about your childhood and your life, of course, you're making yourself more available for these people, unpaid. Okay, thank you. That hurt. But it's true. He invoked a line that I guess is common currency among stand-up comedians. Are kind of similar thing. You show up, who knows where it's going, but there's also a structure. Is that the best advice is to always leave them wanting more. And that idea of leaving your audience wanting more, I mean, you can read that narcissistically as they want more of me. But when we think about that in terms of education or of thinking or of engaging with a thinker, Lacan, Freud, whoever, even as you fulfill certain desires, even as you frustrate certain desires, even as you teach them to relate to their own desires differently, they somehow walk out of it wanting more of that. And reading your book makes me want to read more Lacan again. It makes me want to read your book again. It makes me want to teach more again. And even as there is a termination or an artificial ending, that is endless or generative in some sort of way that just feels wonderful.
Enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nick, I loved the book. I can already tell you that I will come back to various chapters while I'm trying to think with some of these ideas. And, I'm really grateful that it exists and you brought it into the world. If people want to find you on the internet, where can they find you?
Well, I'll go first, Nick. I'm 89 Stock on Twitter. But if you just Google my name, you'll find my institutional webpage as well, where people can email me. And, happy to talk via email, no problem, if people have got any questions or anything.
I'm more difficult to get hold of, but I have some kind of obscure web presence, but my email address is presumably available somewhere, or go through Nick Stock. I try to keep out of harm's way.
I will gatekeep Nick Peim from everybody else. Yeah.
Incredible. Well, thank you both so much. This has been An absolute delight.
I wish we could go on forever and it could be endless, but I also
But then it would be midnight
you.
for the two of
Thank
you.
you both.
No, thank you. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show, help keep it ad-free, and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our ongoing reading of Freud's Standard Edition, please come find us and join the Patreon at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield, Nick Stock, and Nick Peim. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.